Hi guys, Jason Rule with Driven Nutrition here with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. He was kind enough to write us another article talking about protein intake and amino acids and keeping those levels. Some of this is really surprising me as far as the news that you're bringing here. So I'd like to jump right in if you don't mind, Mike.
Yeah, for sure.
So one of the quotes that you put in this article is the protein pounding was actually studied some time ago. The researchers used a constant infusion of amino acids, just like the bros wanted, meaning people thought if they could bring in a huge amount of amino acids over an consistent period of time. Is that what this study was about?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the thought process being is that, most people, once they're convinced that, okay, protein is good, okay. The next thought, right, with the bodybuilding logic, which solves all the world's issues all the time, is that, well, more is better, right? So you get in the amount, well, how much protein is good? And the thought is then, well, let's just eat protein all the time, right? Which leads to, well, what if I just had an IV infusion of amino acids, like, all the time, right? Then I would get as jacked as possible, right? Because in theory, I would have muscle protein synthesis running all the time. And in a research study several years ago, they actually looked exactly at that. They had subjects come in, so human subjects, and they ran an IV of amino acids for, I think it was 6 hours in the study. The thought being at the time, this was many years ago, that, cool, this will show that protein synthesis, right, the process of taking amino acids and stuffing them into muscle tissue, that this will go up and will stay elevated for the entire time that the IV is in. And what they saw was actually not that at all. So the IV did keep amino acids level for 5 to 6 hours, but muscle protein synthesis went up, as we would expect. And then despite keeping the amino acids high, right, so the building blocks of protein, muscle protein synthesis actually started to go back down and never came back up during the whole course of the study, which I think to most people, even now, is pretty surprising. They would not have expected that.
Yeah. So do you know in the study how long, where the peak of that bell curve was? Do you know?
I'd have to look. I think it was probably, if I remember off memory, 45 minutes to an hour, somewhere in there it peaked. So muscle protein synthesis in general tracks pretty good with peak blood levels of amino acids.
Okay.
Relatively close.
Okay. So I think that's fascinating. One is that people would go in and get an IV of amino acids from a study. I mean, I know a lot of guys that would, and gals that would do that in a heartbeat. And it's really neat to see and to read this article about that. That's not only is it not necessary, but it's counterproductive. So how do we time our protein intake or our amino acid intake throughout the day to hit those peaks optimally, so we're not wasting the amino acids or the proteins we're bringing in?
Yeah, the nice part is that most people, unless they go to the extreme, do this pretty well, right? So most people eat probably 3 to 5 meals per day. And if they have all their protein at those meals, or what's called a bolus dose, or a whole bunch of protein at once, by virtue of having, let's say, 3 meals for simple math to start, they're going to have pretty big gaps between their meals, right? So if they eat breakfast, let's say the old school breakfast, lunch, dinner, right? 8 a.m. is breakfast, lunch is at noon, and my grandparents always ate dinner at, used to be 6, then it was 5, and then pretty soon it was like 4 p.m. It kept getting earlier all the time. So by virtue of that, let's say you eat at 6, you have a fair amount of time for amino acid levels to actually drop in between meals. So that's actually pretty good. You could argue that even if you have 5 meals a day, unless you're sleeping, 14 hours a day, you probably have still a fair amount of time in between each meal, right? But the problem is when people overextend that and go, okay, so I'm going to have a meal, I'm going to have a protein shake in between that meal, I'm going to have my other meal, I'm going to have a protein shake in between there, and they just start trying to keep these levels constant all the time, that, in theory, that's probably not going to be the best idea.
So, just as an example, instead of going the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, is it a good idea to introduce it, say, every 3 hours or so, or do we want to go that span of breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Yeah, so right now we don't exactly know, but depending upon an average protein dose of an average amount of protein, 2 to 4 or 5 hours is probably fine.
Okay.
Again, you've got some proteins like your whey hydrostats and different types of whey that'll appear really fast and disappear faster. Such things like caseinates are much slower. That gets into the whole debate if casein is the best protein for muscle protein synthesis. There is studies showing that it does help with recovery used in an overnight situation in specific times.
Right.
But in general, I tell people if you're eating 3 to 5 meals per day and you're having a pretty good chunk of protein in each one of those meals and you're not having protein in between those meals, you're probably going to be pretty good on with that.
And that's assuming a protein dose of, what did you say, 30, 3 by 30 on our last call. You're talking about 3 by 30 for women, 4 by 40 as in grams of protein per meal. Mm-hmm. That's assuming that they're hitting that mark. Is that right?
Right. Yep. So the other part is you want to have enough protein to trip the muscle protein synthetic response. So the main triggers for that are essential amino acids and then leucine. So leucine of about 2.5 to 3.5 grams. It's kind of like turning on the assembly line, but you still need something for them to work with on the assembly line. So you would still need essential amino acids and then obviously some energy to run the assembly line, so some sort of fuel.
Okay.
So if you have all three of those present, and again, fuel could be from stored body fat or other endogenous sources too, you're going to be pretty good at that point. Where people run into trouble is if they use a very inferior protein and they use a very small amount, such as like a soy protein, they're only taking in, say, 10 grams, it's not going to be enough to trip that process. However, one scoop of whey, around 20 grams of whey, has enough essential amino acids, has enough leucine. There's been a couple studies looking as low as, maybe 6 to 8 grams of an essential amino acid. So as long as you get enough of essential amino and enough leucine, you can, in theory, get by on some pretty small doses of protein. Again, you don't get the satiety effects. You may not get the protein breakdown effects, possibly. But, yeah.
Yeah. Well, just going with the branched chain amino acids is a good way to get those aminos in there, and sometimes it's less expensive per serving than a whey protein is. So that's one way. If somebody is full or they have a hard time getting 20 or 40 grams of protein, perhaps that's a way that they can go about adding it in.
Yeah, so what I have people do is if they're eating like a meat source of protein, which they generally run a little bit lower in leucine, so you can make up for that by just having a bigger dose. But if you're only having, let's say, you're a smaller woman, you can only eat maybe 12 to 18 grams of chicken breast at a time, so less than 4 ounces. I have those people consume some type of leucine or a branched chain with that.
Okay. Once
they're good at eating protein, just to make sure you have enough of the leucine threshold at that point.
Okay. So moving from this article, you touched on casein. I want to ask you about, so we get a lot of questions from affiliates as well as athletes. Do you mind breaking down from a category standpoint of, like, if someone is just an average athlete, an average human, I guess, kind of like me, of trying to stay in shape, trying to maintain, and we're just sore all the time, we're not able to recover. Is casein a good thing to add to take before we go to bed, or are we looking more towards a whey protein?
Yeah, so right now, based on the research, I would say whey protein during the day is probably going to be better. There is a study from Dr. Luc van Loon's lab in the Netherlands that looked at specifically casein protein fed before bed overnight. And what they did in the study, super cool study, I think they said it took them 2 years or longer to get this approved, but it's actually a radioactively labeled protein to be used in research. So the way they got that was they had to take the cows that they had specifically raised, they had to put the radioactive tracer in their food, the cow would eat that, and then the cow would produce the milk with this radioactive tracer in it. They would take the milk, they would process it into the different types of proteins. They would then use those proteins actually in their lab to study. And I think he said that whole process took him well over 2 to 3 years, I think, just to get all the approvals, to get IRB, to get everything in process. So that's just to get the protein to do the damn study. And in the study, they were a little worried about, is there maybe digestion issues or not? So what they did is they had subjects come into the lab at night, and they gave them a pretty good gram dose. I think it was 30 or 40 grams of casein in the evening via a nasal tube. So they stick a tube down your nose.
Wow.
So they can give you casein when you're sleeping. And then he said, quote, in the morning, we woke them up with a needle biopsy. So first thing in the morning, they get a biopsy, so a needle driven into their vastus and their quad to pull out a chunk of muscle to see what was going on.
Where was this at?
Luc Van Loon's lab. He's in the Netherlands, I believe.
I mean, were these prisoners, or were they volunteers, or were they paid?
No, they were volunteers. I think they were compensated.
Highly?
In some form. And what they saw with the casein is that it definitely did increase protein synthesis overnight. And the cool part was, since it was a tracer-labeled study, it wasn't just labeled per se, they could kind of determine how much of the protein showed up in muscle tissue. And if I remember right, it was, I think per dose was only around 2.5 grams actually showed up in muscle, if I remember correctly. So meaning that from that particular meal, that dose of protein, your net increase in muscle protein, or I should say lean body mass, I can't remember which one of the two it was 2.5 grams. So exceedingly small, but that's probably pretty normal, right? So if you take that out over the course of a year, you have an advanced athlete, and they do this every night before bed, yeah, you can add a few pounds of muscle. And to some people who are already close to their plateau or extremely competitive, that's a pretty big deal.
Right.
To the average person, maybe not so much, right? And you could argue that the act of doing it really isn't that hard, so it's relatively easy to do. Some people are more concerned about that than other people. The other nice part about the study, too, was that these people were fed normally during the day and even beforehand. So it wasn't like a typical study in the lab where they do it first thing in the morning, and most of the time, not all the studies, but a lot of the studies, they're fasted the entire time until they come into the lab. So in this study, they were actually not fasted all day. So therefore, it makes it more typical to the average person who's going to be eating protein meals during the day also.
Wow. I'm glad I brought up casein. That's a fascinating study.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine subjecting myself to that.
It's pretty crazy because, and then you get a lot of questions of, well, if I take it again in the middle of the night, does that help? Or how big of a dose? Blah blah blah.
Right.
We don't really know, right? Because you, in theory, would have to do a study where you're doing what? It's 1 a.m, time for another muscle biopsy. It's hard enough to imagine get people into a study for that.
Right.
I heard supposedly that he's repeating it with whey protein, but I don't think those results have been published yet. I'm not sure if that study ever went through. So we don't have a study that does the exact same parameters and everything, comparing it to a whey protein. The only thing we have right now was a casein protein, which did show that it was beneficial.
It'd be interesting to know, to see those studies side by side, to see what the uptake or what sticks, the 2.5 grams out of 30 or 40 grams of protein, to see if that ratio holds true from one type of protein to the other.
And that's the other part we don't know yet. And granted, we only know that for the length of the study too, right? So we don't. In theory, that number should probably hold over time, but we don't have a chronic study on that. There's chronic protein feeding studies, but there's usually some type of resistance training. There's a whole bunch of other kind of variables and stuff that go into that. And in those studies, we do see that people do gain lean body mass, getting their protein up higher, and with resistance training, again, not earth-shattering to anyone listening to this.
Right. They've heard it a couple hundred times already, if not thousands.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, that's, the article is pretty straightforward. We'll be posting it up on our website along with this video here in the next few days. Now, one thing I failed to do is to where can people who are watching this or listening to this, where can people find you?
Yeah, sure. They can just probably go to my website. It's just MikeTNelson.com.
Okay.
I have all sorts of stuff and articles, and you can get on my newsletter and things like that there too. And then also wanted to say the first time I heard about this concept was from Dr. Lane Norton. So big thanks to him. I know he's done a lot of work in that area with leucine metabolism and things of that nature. That was, oh man, probably some time ago. So it's always good to try to hopefully spread some of the info around.
Right.
And then last thing I'm still not sure about is a question people have about should you be consuming protein during training or like as an intra-workout drink. And as of now, my guess is I don't think it's that useful. My gut feeling is that if you have something beforehand, you have a protein carbohydrate drink, let's say before your weight training session, you do your weight training session, and you have something to eat afterwards, I think that's probably going to be pretty beneficial. We'll talk later about timing or things of that nature. What I switched to over the past year is that people are doing longer than an hour session. I'll only have them use carbohydrates during training. Now, I don't know, I haven't seen any direct studies looking at this or not. My thought being that the carbohydrates during training will provide fuel source, may help reduce some of the stress of training. You know, John Meadows is a big fan of that. He's done a lot of stuff in that area on the experience side. My other thought is that I maybe want that protein levels to drop off a little bit so it can kind of come back up again at the end. And that by having protein all the time during training in addition to that, we know it's probably not going to do anything to max out protein synthesis. That's probably pretty much maxed out beforehand. And that in theory, right, and this hasn't been shown yet, maybe we want that to drop down and kind of come back up again too. So maybe by having levels of protein be high during the training bout also, maybe that's a little bit on the negative side. So
fascinating. Cool. I look forward to finding out.
Maybe a little more practical.
Yeah. And certainly less expensive than having to drink protein also while you work out. If it's not needed, there's extra step and extra cost.
Yeah, and I mean, I've experimented with it, and I can't say I noticed any difference either way. I definitely didn't notice any detriment per se as a N of 1. So.
Okay, all right, roger that. I think that covers my questions for this article. Thank you again for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Greatly appreciate it.
Oh, I'm enjoying our weekly talks.
Yeah, it was a good time.
So, Jason Rule from Driven Nutrition, Dr. Mike Nelson, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to next week and getting this article out there for everybody to read.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right.